Welcome to this deep dive. Whether you're preparing for a strategic briefing or you're just curious about the underlying mechanics of global trade, you're in the right place.
Absolutely.
Today, we're looking at the Hormuz Strait crisis. And based on the documentation we're unpacking today, obviously we're observing intense military actions involving the U.S., Israel, Iran.
Right.
But right up front, we need to clarify our analytical lens. We're not here to take a political side or endorse any specific geopolitical viewpoint.
Oh,
We're just examining the data.
exactly. We're looking at the systemic fallout.
Right. And our mission today is to look at this crisis from a totally different angle. Instead of looking at this simply as a story about oil prices, we're examining it through the lens of the stability of the global logistics system.
That's the crucial shift.
Yeah. The key idea we want to present to you today is this. The world is not actually running out of resources. What's becoming unstable are the routes that move them.
And that is the exact perspective required to understand the current data. I mean, if you review the traditional energy crises, like the massive shocks in the 1970s,
The oil embargoes and all that.
right, those events were overwhelmingly framed as resource shortages. The primary fear was a lack of physical supply.
They thought we were just running out of oil.
Exactly. But what the sources indicate today is fundamentally different. We aren't looking at a lack of supply. We are looking at transportation choke points becoming deeply unstable.
There's a huge distinction.
It is. And to grasp what's happening to the foundational system that sustains your daily life, we basically need to analyze three layers: geopolitics, energy markets, and maritime logistics.
And as a quick reminder, this channel functions as an ongoing structural observation log. We revisit these massive global events not to produce, finalized magic bullet predictions.
Because those don't exist.
Right. We do it to refine how we read the system together. Over time, the underlying architecture of global trade just becomes much clearer.
It really does.
So let's start with a basic fact from the data just to establish the scale of the issue here. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day pass through the Hormuz Strait.
That's a massive volume.
It's about 20% of the entire global oil supply. And if we want to see how this impacts a specific major economy, the sources point to Japan. A staggering 93% of Japan's crude oil relies on this single waterway.
93%.
Yeah. That single statistic makes the Hormuz Strait one of the most critical choke points on the planet.
And the really important distinction those numbers reveal is a massive asymmetry in global trade.
What do you mean by asymmetry?
Well, resources like oil, natural gas, essential minerals, they're relatively distributed across the globe.
Yeah.
But the transportation routes required to move those resources are highly concentrated into these very narrow, geographically fragile corridors.
Ah.
So this specific asymmetry between distributed resources and concentrated transit routes that creates systemic vulnerability. When a single narrow strait controls that much energy needed for industrial economies, the whole framework is at risk from localized instability.
But the implication goes significantly beyond oil, though.
Absolutely.
The data highlights that 23% of Japan's aluminum imports also travel through this exact same route. So we aren't just talking about liquid fuels, we're talking about the raw physical materials required for manufacturing.
Right.
But isn't there usually a workaround in global trade? Like, if a maritime strait becomes too dangerous, can't these companies just utilize overland pipelines or alternative shipping lanes?
It's a logical question, but it runs into a mathematical impossibility when you look at the sheer scale of global commerce.
Because of the volume.
Exactly. Around 80 to 90% of all global trade moves by sea. The volume of goods carried by a single ultra-large crude carrier or one of those massive container ships, it just cannot be replicated by overland truck fleets or existing pipelines.
There just aren't enough trucks in the world.
Not even close. Which means these maritime routes function as a vital part of the world's invisible infrastructure. You can really think of these shipping lanes as an operating system for global trade.
A logistics OS.
Yeah, a logistics OS. Just like the operating system running your smartphone, it manages millions of complex background processes that makes the visible economy function.
And like any operating system, we rarely notice it when everything is running smoothly.
The goods just arrive.
Exactly. But when that underlying system starts to encounter friction, the entire architecture becomes incredibly visible. The sources note that over 40 Japanese-related vessels are currently idling, just stuck in the Persian Gulf right now.
Just waiting.
Yeah. Major global shipping operators, including NYK, MOL, and K-Line, have actually halted their operations in that specific area. The physical machinery of trade has essentially paused in that corridor.
And that's exactly why the situation in Hormuz requires close attention, regardless of where you live. The core issue is less about the daily fluctuations of oil prices on financial exchanges, and much more about the fragility of that logistics OS.
Because when the ships start moving,
The global assembly line halts.
right. So if the ships are already stuck and operations are halting, how long before we actually feel this at the grocery store or the gas pump? Let's examine the timeline dimension of this disruption. How does an event of this magnitude actually unfold across different time horizons?
Based on historical data and current market reactions, we can divide this into three distinct horizons.
Okay, let's start with the short term.
In the short term, the immediate reaction is characterized by financial volatility rather than physical scarcity.
So it's about panic.
Exactly. The focus is on oil price spikes and rising shipping insurance costs. For example, our sources show that Brent crude temporarily spiked to nearly $119.50 a barrel, primarily due to headline geopolitical risks.
Markets pricing in the worst-case scenario immediately.
Right. But then the price corrected back down to around $90 when it became clear that physical supply wasn't instantly cut off. During this phase, you also see companies executing temporary rerouting efforts to avoid immediate danger zones.
So the initial phase is driven by financial hedging and risk pricing. But as the initial panic fades and oil drops back to $90, those ships are still idling. What happens in the medium term when factories start running out of the raw materials they had in storage?
The medium term is where the physical reality of the bottleneck really begins to constrain the economy.
The structural friction.
Yes. The focus shifts to higher sustained transportation costs and severe logistical friction in energy markets. A primary example detailed in the research is the petrochemical shock.
What exactly is that?
Well, when tankers are delayed or trapped, you experience a critical lack of naphtha imports. This shortage is currently threatening to halt operations in major ethylene plants, like those run by Idemitsu and Mitsubishi Chemical.
Let's pause there for a second to clarify the mechanics. We hear terms like naphtha and ethylene frequently in energy reports. But what are we actually talking about here? How do we draw a straight line from a blocked waterway in the Middle East to a missing consumer product on a store shelf?
It's a crucial supply chain to understand. Naphtha is a highly flammable liquid hydrocarbon mixture that's distilled directly from crude oil.
Okay.
Once a refinery produces naphtha, it's sent to a specialized facility called a cracker. These facilities apply immense heat and pressure to crack the naphtha molecules apart, which produces ethylene.
And ethylene is used for plastics, right?
Exactly. Ethylene is the fundamental chemical building block for polyethylene, which is the most common plastic in the world. So if the crude oil doesn't arrive, the naphtha isn't distilled.
If the naphtha isn't distilled, the ethylene plants shut down.
You've got it.
Yeah.
And when those plants halt, the downstream production of everyday items, I mean, everything from plastic car bumpers and medical devices to the basic sterile packaging used for your groceries, it all comes to a complete stop.
Wow. That perfectly illustrates the cascading failure of an operating system. A delay in raw material transport translates directly into a manufacturing freeze.
It's immediate.
So if that is the medium term, what does a chronic long-term disruption look like for a major economy?
The long-term horizon involves the fundamental reconfiguration of trade routes. Industries simply cannot function in a state of permanent unpredictability.
They have to adapt.
Right. If we look at the macroeconomic scenarios modeled by the Nomura Research Institute, their data indicates that in a severe, prolonged blockade scenario, a major economy like Japan could face a 0.65% downward push on its gross domestic product.
You know, a 0.65% drop might sound abstract to someone casually reviewing the data. What does that percentage actually translate to in a real-world economic environment?
For an economy the size of Japan's, that represents tens of billions of dollars in lost economic output. But more importantly, the researchers note that this kind of supply-side drag accelerates stagflation.
Stagnant growth plus inflation.
Exactly. Stagflation is a highly damaging economic condition. In practical terms, it means the cost of everyday goods continues to rise rapidly because importing them has become incredibly expensive and inefficient.
But simultaneously, the broader economy is shrinking.
Yes. So wages stagnate and businesses freeze hiring. It diminishes your purchasing power from both ends simultaneously.
So the issue gradually shifts from energy supply to logistics architecture. If we expand our view beyond just the Hormuz Strait, are we looking at an isolated geographic vulnerability, or is this indicative of a broader architectural problem in global trade?
The data strongly suggests the latter. This phenomenon is not isolated to Hormuz. We're observing identical systemic pressures manifesting across multiple maritime corridors simultaneously.
Like the Red Sea.
Right. Consider the ongoing disruptions in the Red Sea, where commercial vessels are being forced to abandon the Suez Canal route entirely. Instead, they're taking the massive detour around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa.
Which has to add huge costs.
It adds weeks of transit time and millions of dollars in fuel cost per voyage. Additionally, we are tracking sustained geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea, which is a corridor that carries roughly one-third of all global shipping.
So when you analyze these data points together,
They point toward something much larger. The entire global trade network is experiencing profound systemic stress.
which suggests a critical shift in perspective for you as the listener. The real transformation we are analyzing right now may not be about energy resources at all. The underlying map of how things move across the world economy is being fundamentally redrawn.
That is an accurate assessment.
Hmm.
And it's vital to understand that this logic applies far beyond the energy sector. The exact same vulnerability profile affects logistics for global food supply chains, the semiconductor industry, and AI hardware development.
Let's unpack that further. It's easy to visualize massive tankers full of oil relying on these deepwater straits. But why are advanced technologies like AI chips or essential agricultural inputs just as vulnerable to these specific maritime bottlenecks?
Well, let's take agriculture first. Modern high-yield farming relies entirely on continuous inputs of specialized fertilizers. The core ingredients for these fertilizers, bulk commodities like potash and phosphates, they're mined in massive quantities in specific regions, such as Canada, Russia, and North Africa. Because of their immense weight and volume, they can only be transported economically via bulk carrier ships.
So if maritime corridors become too dangerous or expensive, fertilizer distribution breaks down.
Exactly. Crop yields drop and global food prices spike.
And regarding the technology sector, we tend to think of the digital economy as existing in the cloud, divorced from physical shipping lanes.
It's a common misconception, but the cloud requires massive physical infrastructure. The semiconductor supply chain is arguably the most complex physical logistics network in human history.
Because of the equipment involved.
Yes. The specialized raw materials, the incredibly delicate silicon wafers, the multi-billion-dollar lithography machines required to manufacture advanced AI microchips. These are massive pieces of industrial equipment.
They can't just be emailed.
No, they require vast logistical networks that involve both air freight and maritime shipping across the Pacific and through the South China Sea. Furthermore, when tech companies build new data centers to power AI models, they're importing thousands of heavy liquid-cooled server racks. The physical layer that connects our digital world relies entirely on the same vulnerable shipping corridors as petroleum and aluminum.
That actually brings us to a crucial observation regarding the current state of this crisis. Despite these extreme geopolitical tensions, and despite the very real disruptions in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, the global system hasn't reacted with a complete sustained catastrophe yet.
It hasn't.
We mentioned earlier that the oil price spiked to nearly $120 but then settled back down. To an observer tracking retail prices, things might seem relatively stable right now. Why are the visible effects still so muted?
The underlying mechanics of that apparent silence are fascinating. It's largely because the immense costs of this friction are currently being absorbed internally by the system itself.
They haven't cascaded down to the consumer yet.
Exactly. For example, maritime insurance markets are currently adjusting in the background, absorbing and pricing in massive risk premiums quietly. Major freight companies are dealing with huge operational price increases due to rerouting around Africa, but they're often absorbing those costs temporarily to maintain market share or honor long-term shipping contracts.
They're eating the cost.
For now, yes. Furthermore, political systems are utilizing their buffering mechanisms, such as releasing strategic petroleum reserves, to artificially suppress market panic. The friction absolutely exists in the data, but it is currently hidden deep inside the supply chain's plumbing.
Which means that silence should not be mistaken for actual stability.
Not at all.
If a company is eating the cost of a massive shipping delay, that is a temporary financial maneuver, not a structural solution. Just because the systemic warning lights aren't flashing for the average consumer yet doesn't mean the foundational infrastructure isn't under extreme stress.
From an analytical standpoint, you're absolutely correct. In complex systems, a period of silence or apparent normalcy simply means that the system still possesses absorption capacity.
The buffers are still holding.
The economic shock absorbers are fully compressed, and they're holding the tension, but they haven't broken yet. The critical variable we are tracking is how long that capacity lasts.
Because eventually they run out.
Because once those corporate and governmental buffers are exhausted, the accumulated costs of logistical friction will cascade rapidly down the supply chain, inevitably manifesting as broad-based inflation across fuel, food, and consumer goods.
As we compress the analysis we've covered today, let's review the fundamental architecture of this situation.
If we distill the data points across energy markets, macroeconomics, and maritime tracking, the core takeaway is clear. What is shaking right now is not the global resource base. It is the transport routes that sustain global trade.
And if we assess the trajectory of these events, the structural slope here, the stability of those routes is gradually, consistently weakening.
Which leaves you with a forward question to consider as you monitor global supply chain developments in the coming months.
Is this merely a temporary geopolitical disruption? Or are we witnessing the early signs of a complete reconfiguration of the global logistics system itself?
That is the pivotal issue.
The Hormuz crisis reveals the fragility of the global logistics operating system.
Are these disruptions isolated events, or the beginning of a broader shift in how the world's trade routes are organized?